Gideon Pike didn't look at his niece when he counted the money. That was the part Maeve Holloway would remember for the rest of her life, not the cold, not the strangers standing in her uncle's doorway with his hat in his hands, not even the sound of coins hitting the kitchen table one by one. It was the fact that Gideon never once looked at her. He counted $50 like he was selling a lame horse, and when the last coin landed, he finally spoke. "Cook, she can mend. She doesn't complain much." The man in the doorway, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, somewhere past 35, glanced at Maeve once. Just once. Then he nodded. Nobody asked her. Nobody asked her a single thing. If you have ever felt invisible in your own life, passed over, handed off, treated like something to be managed rather than a person to be known, then you already understand what Maeve felt standing in that kitchen doorway on the coldest morning Wyoming had seen in a decade. And if you've never felt that way, stay with this story anyway. Because what happens next will show you exactly what a woman can become when the world has given her absolutely nothing to work with. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Maeve's journey all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, winter of 1878, and meet the woman nobody thought was worth asking. The morning Gideon sold her, Maeve had been awake since before dawn. She had made biscuits not because anyone asked her to, but because her hands needed something to do, and the kitchen was the only room in the house where she felt like she had a right to exist. She'd lived with Gideon Pike for 3 years, ever since her parents died of fever on the road between Nebraska and the Wyoming Territory, and in those 3 years she had learned exactly what she was to him. Not a niece, not even a responsibility he'd taken on out of obligation. She was labor. She was a warm body that cooked his meals, scrubbed his floors, mended his shirts, and cost him money every time she ate. She was 18 years old, and she already knew what it felt like to be resented for breathing. The biscuits were just coming out of the oven when she heard the wagon outside. She didn't think anything of it. Gideon had visitors, sometimes men from town, other ranchers, the occasional trader passing through. She wiped her hands on her apron and started setting out plates, because that was what she did. That was the role she had been assigned, and doing it well was the only dignity she had managed to hold on to. Then Gideon came through the back door and said, without looking at her, "Leave those. Come here." She set down the tin plate. The man standing in the front room was not what she expected. She had expected someone old, maybe more rough, in the obvious way that some frontier men were rough loud, sunburned, smelling of whiskey. Silas Mercer was none of those things. He was tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it hadn't relaxed in years. His coat was clean, but worn at the elbows. His boots were practical, not showy. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem. He's trying to calculate, not unkind, exactly, but entirely without warmth. "This is her," Gideon said. Silas Mercer nodded slowly. "How old?" 18, healthy, works hard." Maeve stood perfectly still. She understood with a cold and complete clarity that this was not an introduction. This was an inspection. "She got family somewhere else?" Silas asked. "No," another nod. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. He set it on the table next to the biscuits Maeve had just made, and Gideon picked it up without hesitation, without ceremony, without even the decency to look ashamed. "There's a wagon outside," Silas said, finally speaking directly to her. "You'll want to bring whatever you can carry. It's a long ride, and it'll be dark before we get there." Maeve opened her mouth, closed it. "I don't," she started. "Gideon's handled the arrangement," Silas said. Not cruel, not gentle, just flat like he was reading from a ledger. "You'll be keeping house, looking after my children. Honest work, and you'll have a roof." She looked at Gideon. Gideon was already moving toward the door. She had maybe 30 seconds to understand that this was happening, that there was no argument she could make, no door she could run to, No one in the world who would come looking for her if she simply disappeared into the Wyoming winter with a stranger who had just paid $50 for the right to direct her labor. She went to her room. She packed what she could carry: a spare dress, 2 pairs of wool stockings, her mother's small tin mirror, a book she'd read so many times the spine had split and been re-glued with flour paste. She did not say goodbye to Gideon Pike. She walked past him, out the door, and climbed up into the wagon beside a man she had known for less than 10 minutes. Cold hit her like a wall. They rode for nearly 4 hours without speaking. Maeve sat with her bag on her lap, and her shoulders pulled together against the wind, watching the landscape flatten and then roll and then flatten again into the kind of emptiness that made you feel very small and very far from anything that had ever mattered. Silas drove with the reins easy in his hands, his eyes on the trail ahead, his face giving nothing away. He tried once. "You said you have children." "3. How old?" A pause. Like the question required actual consideration. 8, 6, and 3. She waited to see if he would offer names. He didn't. What happened to their mother? The silence that followed was different from the other silences. It had weight to it. "She died," Silas said. 2 years ago. Fever." "I'm sorry." He didn't answer that. Just flicked the reins slightly and stared ahead at the trail. And Maeve understood without being told that this was a subject she was not meant to approach again. Not directly, maybe not ever. She looked at her hands instead. She thought about the $50 sitting in Gideon's coat pocket. She wondered if it had been exactly 50 or if Gideon had asked for more and been talked down. She wondered if Silas Mercer had done this before, driven out to find a woman he could bring back, to manage his house and his children, like she was a piece of furniture he'd ordered from a catalog. She wondered what the children would make of her. 8, 6, and 3. Old enough to remember their mother, old enough to resent a stranger walking into her place. She was so busy not thinking about how frightened she was that she didn't notice the moment the trail crested a low rise and the ranch appeared below them. It sat in a natural hollow between 2 long ridges, sheltered from the worst of the wind, but still exposed to the open sky in a way that made it feel very alone. The main house was bigger than she'd expected. 2 stories, solid timber, with a covered porch that wrapped around one side. Barn, a smaller outbuilding, a fence line that needed work, smoke from the chimney, lamplight in one window. It looked like a home that had forgotten how to be one. The oldest boy was waiting on the porch when they pulled up. 8 years old, dark-haired like his father, with eyes that tracked her the way an animal tracks, something unfamiliar, not aggressive, exactly, but not welcoming either. He watched her climb down from the wagon without offering to help and without looking away. "Caleb," Silas said. "This is Miss Holloway. She'll be staying." Caleb said nothing. His jaw was set in a way that looked, on a child that age, almost heartbreaking, like he'd already decided something and wasn't going to be talked out of it. The middle child, Owen, appeared in the doorway behind him. 6 years old, thinner than the oldest, with enormous dark eyes, and a thumb hovering near his mouth that he pulled away quickly when he saw Maeve looking. He gave her a look that was equal parts curiosity and suspicion, then darted behind his brother. "Where's June?" Silas asked. "Inside," Caleb said. "Fell asleep waiting." Silas nodded and carried Maeve's bag up the porch steps without asking her. She followed him through the door and into the main room of the house, and the first thing that hit her was the cold. Not the outside cold that followed her in through the door, but a different cold, the kind that lives inside a house where the warmth has been let go of. Dishes stacked but not quite clean. A floor swept but not scrubbed. A coat hanging from a chair back because no one had bothered to hang it on its hook. A house being survived, not lived in. She set her bag down by the door, on the settee near the dead fireplace. Wrapped in a quilt that was half falling off her was June. 3 years old, round-cheeked, dark lashes against pale skin. Sleeping with her mouth slightly open, one small fist curled under her chin. Something moved in Maeve's chest that she didn't expect. She hadn't let herself think about whether she wanted to be here. She hadn't let herself think about much of anything since she climbed into that wagon, because thinking led to feeling, and feeling led to places she couldn't afford to go right now. But standing in this cold, half-dark room, looking at this sleeping child in her falling-down quilt, she felt something break loose that she'd been holding very tightly. She crossed the room quietly and pulled the quilt up around June's shoulders. The little girl stirred but didn't wake. When Maeve turned around, Caleb was standing in the doorway, watching her. Couldn't read his expression. "Where should I sleep?" she asked Silas. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "It's small." "That's fine." She picked up her bag and followed him through the back of the house. The room off the kitchen was, as promised, small. Cot, a washstand, a window that looked out at the barn. No curtain on the window. A hook on the wall for hanging clothes. Silas set her bag on the cot. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man who had planned out this conversation and then forgotten how it was supposed to go. "I don't expect," he started. "I'll start breakfast early," Maeve said. "You can show me where things are kept. I'll manage from there." He blinked. Like she'd surprised him. "The pantry's through the kitchen. The children eat at 6. I eat at 6. "All right." He nodded. He started to leave. Then he stopped with his hand on the doorframe and said, "Without turning around, Evelyn kept things a particular way. I'd appreciate." He stopped himself. Whatever he'd been about to say, he thought better of it. "Breakfast at 6, he said instead, and left. Maeve sat down on the cot. The mattress was thin, and the springs complained. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the wall and breathed, just breathed, in and out, steadily, the way she'd taught herself to do when she was 14. And her parents were sick, and she was the only one left to be calm. She had been purchased. She had been driven 4 hours in the cold by a man who hadn't bothered to ask her name once during the entire journey. She was sleeping in a room the size of a closet in a house with 3 children who smelled like grief, who already resented her, and a man who talked to her like she was a problem he'd budgeted for. She had nothing. She was nothing. She was $50 worth of labor. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she took her mother's mirror out of her bag and hung it on the hook above the washstand. And she took the book with the repaired spine and set it on the windowsill. And she lay down on the cot and pulled the blanket up and told herself that surviving required one thing above all others. Required deciding to. She decided to. The cold settled in around the house, like it planned to stay all winter. And somewhere in the front room, June made a small sound in her sleep, and the lamp in the kitchen burned low. And Maeve Holloway closed her eyes in a place she had not chosen and began, in the only way she knew how, to figure out how to make it through to morning. She was up before anyone else. The kitchen was dark and cold, and the fire had gone almost entirely out overnight. She rebuilt it without making noise, nursing the coals back with dry tinder and patience, then stood over it, with her hand spread toward the growing warmth until she stopped shaking. Found the pantry. It was not as bad as she'd feared. Dried beans, a side of salt pork, cornmeal, a nearly empty sack of flour, jars of preserved things she'd have to examine more closely in daylight. She found a cast-iron skillet and a Dutch oven and a coffee pot that had seen better days. She found a small jar of honey tucked behind everything else, like something hidden rather than stored. She made coffee first. Then she put salt pork on to render and started mixing biscuits. By the time the sky outside the window had gone from black to gray, the kitchen smelled like something. Like breakfast. Like someone lived here. Owen appeared first, at 5:50 before any of the others. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his stocking feet, with sleep-tousled hair, and stared at her like she might be a hallucination. "Is that biscuits?" he said. "It will be," she said. "Do you want to sit?" He looked at the chair like it might be a trap. Then he sat in it very carefully, like he was following rules she didn't know about. "Caleb doesn't want you here," he said. Maeve turned the salt pork. "I know. Neither does Papa. He just didn't have a choice." Kept her face neutral. "What about you?" Owen considered this with the absolute seriousness of a 6-year-old handling a difficult question. I haven't decided yet, he said. She put a biscuit on a plate and slid it in front of him with the small jar of honey. That's fair, she said. He ate the entire biscuit without speaking. Then he looked at the empty plate and at her and said, in a different voice, quieter, younger, "Do you know how to make corn pudding?" "I do. Mama used to make it." The silence stretched. She heard it land between them, that small, fragile word. She didn't rush past it or talk around it. She just let it sit there, acknowledged. "If you show me how she made it," Maeve said carefully, "I can try to make it like she did." Owen looked at her. He had his father's eyes, but not his father's guardedness. In his face, she could see every thought moving through him like weather. "Put nutmeg in," he said. "Papa doesn't know that. Then we'll put nutmeg in." He nodded, like a deal had been struck. When Silas came down 20 minutes later, the kitchen was warm and the table was set, and June was in her chair eating biscuit pieces with her fingers, and Owen was on his second cup of warm milk. Caleb had not come down. Silas stopped in the doorway exactly the way Owen had, like he'd expected something and found something different. "Caleb won't come down," Owen reported without looking up. "I'll speak to him." "I already did," Maeve said. "He doesn't have to. Not today." Silas looked at her. "I'm not going to force him," she said simply. "He's not ready. That's his right." The look on his face was unreadable, but he sat down and poured his coffee and didn't argue. Told her something. He was a man who would not be easily moved, but he was not unreasonable. She would work with that. She would work with what she had. She always had. She folded her hands in her lap, out of sight below the table, and pressed them together hard, letting herself feel the pressure. Then she let go. She had one day behind her. She had whatever came next ahead of her. She picked up her coffee cup, and she drank it. And outside the window, the Wyoming sky went from gray to pale white, and somewhere above them, in his room, Caleb Mercer sat on the edge of his bed in the cold and stared at the door and tried everything he had not to smell the biscuits. Caleb came down for breakfast the next morning. He didn't announce it. He didn't apologize for missing the day before. He simply appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6 o'clock with his hair uncombed and his shirt buttoned wrong, and he sat down in the chair farthest from Maeve without looking at her and poured himself coffee like he'd been doing it for years, which he probably had. Maeve put a plate in front of him and said nothing. He ate without thanking her. She didn't expect him to. What she noticed, though what she filed away quietly and didn't make a show of noticing, was that he cleaned his plate, every last bite. And when Owen knocked over his milk cup and the whole mess went sliding toward Caleb's side of the table, Caleb caught the cup before it hit the floor with a reflex that was pure instinct, pure older brother, and he set it back upright and looked at Owen with an expression that was half irritation and half something much softer that he immediately put away. He loved his brother. That was clear. He loved his sister too. She had seen it the night before, when June had reached for Caleb from the settee, and he had picked her up without hesitating, without making a production of it, just folded her into his arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. He was 8 years old, and he was holding this family together with everything he had. That was why he didn't trust her. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even stubbornness, not really. It was that he had been the one to step into the gap when his mother died, and some part of him knew the way children know things they don't have words for yet. That if he let someone else in, he would have to put down a weight he'd been carrying for 2 years. And putting it down meant admitting how heavy it had been. She understood that more than she could explain to anyone. She left him alone. The days that followed had a shape to them that she built deliberately, the way you'd lay a foundation carefully, one piece at a time, making sure each thing was level before you added the next. She rose before dawn and had the kitchen warm by the time anyone else stirred. She learned which floorboards creaked and avoided them when June was sleeping. She found the box of Evelyn's recipes written in a careful, slanted hand tucked into the back of the pantry shelf, and she read through them slowly one evening, by lamplight, treating each page like something that might tear. She didn't throw them away. She didn't replace them. She started cooking from them. Owen noticed first. He came into the kitchen on the fourth day and stopped dead when he smelled what was on the stove. "That's Mama's potato soup," he said. "I found her recipe," Maeve said. "I hope I got it right. I added a little more salt than she wrote, because the salt pork I used was less salty than it should have been, so I wasn't sure. Can I taste it?" She handed him the spoon. He tasted it. His face did something complicated, a whole history moving through it in about 3 seconds, and then he handed the spoon back and said, "It needs more pepper." "How much more?" Mama did 2 turns of the grinder. Maeve turned the pepper grinder twice. "Better?" He tasted it again, nodded very seriously. "Better." She made a small mark in pencil beside the recipe. 2 turns. He watched her do it. "You wrote in her book," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Just a pencil mark. It can be erased if you want it erased." Thought about that for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No, leave it." She left it. Silas watched all of this from a careful distance. She could feel him watching, not in a threatening way, but in the way of a man who had learned not to trust improvements, because improvements had a habit of turning out to be temporary. Ate what she cooked, and thanked her for it with the same 2 words every morning, and every evening, much obliged, delivered with the same tone, whether she'd made something extraordinary or simply managed not to burn the oatmeal. He fixed things when they broke, which was often, and he worked from before sunrise to after sunset, without complaint and without conversation. She respected that about him, even when she found it exhausting. On the 6th day, she found the leather belt. It was hanging on a hook in the mudroom, and at first she thought it was Silas. It was a man's belt, wide and dark, but it was too short for a grown man, and when she lifted it, she saw that it had been repaired, neatly, with a thin strip of leather stitched over a crack near the buckle. Someone had taken time with it. The stitches were even and careful. She turned it over and found a small letter "Sem" scratched into the inside of the leather. M for Mercer, or possibly M for something else. She hung it back on its hook. She didn't ask about it. Some things in this house were not hers to ask about. Yet, maybe ever. And she had learned early that pushing at closed doors in this family had the same effect as pushing at closed doors anywhere. It made people push back harder. What she did instead was push at the open ones. Owen was the most open. He was 6 and curious and lonely in the way of middle children, who have learned to be invisible, and he attached himself to her gradually over those first 2 weeks in the way of something that has been waiting for a place to attach. He followed her through the house, asking questions about everything. Why did she fold the sheets that particular way? What was the difference between sage and rosemary? Could a person really tell weather by the way a horse's ears moved? She answered every question seriously, which seemed to be what he needed most. June was easier in some ways and harder in others. She was 3, and 3-year-olds didn't have the machinery yet. For distrust, they ran on instinct and immediate impression. And Maeve's immediate impression, apparently, was acceptable. By the end of the first week, June was following her through the kitchen, calling her May because the full name was too much for her, and by the end of the second week, she had taken to climbing into Maeve's lap during the evening hours without asking permission, simply arriving there and arranging herself and going still. Maeve held her every time, without making it a thing. It was Caleb who held out, and she let him. She found ways to be useful to him without asking for anything in return. She mended the tear in his jacket without mentioning it, just hung it back where he'd left it with the tear closed. She made sure his books were stacked where he'd left them and didn't touch his room. When he needed something thread, a nail, the location of a tool he couldn't find, she helped without commentary, and when he said nothing in return, she didn't press. He was watching her. She knew it. She just didn't know yet what he was watching for. Then the third week brought the cold snap. Came down from the north on a Tuesday night, dropping the temperature so fast that the water in the basin froze by morning, and the horses in the barn were stamping and restless before anyone had lit the first lamp. Silas went out before dawn to check the stock and came back in grim-faced, tracking mud, not speaking. Maeve had the coffee ready, and she handed him a cup. and he took it without the usual much obliged, which told her the cold was worse than he was showing. June woke up that morning with a cough. By afternoon, it had moved into her chest. Maeve knew the sound of it. She had heard it before. On her father before the fever took him, on a neighbor's child back in Nebraska who had not made it through to spring. Wet, labored pull of breath that meant the cold had found a weakness and moved in. She went to the pantry and found what she needed: dried chamomile, a heel of ginger root, the last of the honey, a piece of flannel she cut from an old shirt she'd found in the rag pile. She set water to heat. Silas came in from the yard and found her at the stove with her sleeves pushed up and her hair coming loose from its braid, and he stopped when he heard June coughing from the back room. "How bad?" he asked. "Not good," she said, because she would not lie to him about his child. "She needs to stay warm, and I need to keep moisture in the air. I need another pot, and I need you to keep the fire going through the night. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was starting to read, the one where he was deciding whether to trust a thing, and then he said, "I'll keep the fire." "Good." She stayed with June through the afternoon and into the evening. She made a steam tent from 2 chairs and an old wool blanket and held June under it in her lap, letting the warm vapor do its work, singing low under her breath, not songs she'd learned in church, just the wordless kind of tune her mother used to hum when she was doing dishes, shapeless and soft. June held Maeve's finger in both small hands and breathed. Owen came to the doorway every hour. "Is she better?" "She's the same." "That's all right for now." "When will she be better?" "I don't know, but I'm not leaving." He went away and came back. He brought June's cloth rabbit from her cot and tucked it under the blanket without being asked. He sat on the floor outside the doorway, with his knees pulled up, and refused to go to bed even when Silas told him to. Silas told him twice. Then he let him stay. Around midnight, Maeve heard footsteps in the hallway that were too quiet to be Silas and too heavy to be Owen. She looked up and found Caleb standing in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest and his face arranged into its usual careful blankness, except that it wasn't quite working. His jaw was tight. His eyes were fixed on June with an intensity that he was trying very hard to make look like nothing. "She had this before," he said quietly. "When Mama—" He stopped. "Tell me," Maeve said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then she had this kind of cough when Mama got sick. She had it at the same time. And Mama—" He stopped again. "Mama made her better. And then Mama got worse instead of better. And she—" Maeve understood. She understood exactly. "I won't leave her," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever happens, Caleb, I am not leaving this room. Not to sleep. Not for anything. You have my word." He stood in the doorway for another long moment. Then he unfolded his arms and sat down next to Owen against the hallway wall, and neither of the boys spoke. And Maeve turned back to June and kept the steam going and kept singing under her breath. And outside the wind came down hard off the ridge and hit the house like something that wanted in. Silas kept the fire. He came back every 2 hours through the night to load more wood without being asked, and each time he came, he stood for a moment in the doorway of June's room and looked at his daughter and at Maeve and said nothing. But she could see what was in his face when he didn't know she was looking, not the rancher's blankness, not the managed grief, just a man terrified of losing something else. She understood that too. The second night was worse than the first. June's fever climbed by mid-morning of the second day, and Maeve responded without panic, which was the only way she knew how to respond to things that frightened her. She stripped June down to her undershirt and used cool, damp cloths on her forehead and neck and the insides of her wrists, working steadily, replacing each cloth as it warmed. She kept the honey water going small sips as often as she could get June to take them. She talked to the child even when June was too hot and too tired to respond, just kept her voice low and steady and present, because she had learned somewhere that voices mattered, even when the person hearing them couldn't answer back. Owen brought her food she didn't eat. Silas brought coffee she drank cold 2 hours after he'd made it. Caleb appeared at intervals she would look up, and he would be there, saying nothing, watching, and then he would disappear again. On the evening of the second day, June's fever broke. It didn't happen dramatically. One moment the child's skin was burning, and the next it was damp and cool, and June made a small sound and turned her head and opened her eyes, really opened them, focused, present, and looked up at Maeve with something that was almost recognition. "May," she said. Her voice was a rasp. "I'm here," Maeve said, thirsty. Maeve got the honey water. From the hallway, she heard Owen say, in a voice full of 6-year-old relief so intense, it came out half like a laugh and half like a sob. She talked. "Papa," she talked. She heard Silas's footsteps heavier, faster than usual. And then he was in the doorway, and June turned her head toward him and said, "Papa." And Silas Mercer crossed the room in 2 steps and knelt beside the cot and put his hand very carefully on his daughter's head. He didn't speak. His eyes were closed. Maeve stood up quietly and went to the corner of the room to give him the moment. And she stood there with her back to them and pressed her fingers hard against her own mouth and breathed through her nose until the feeling passed. She heard June say, "Thank you, Mama Maeve." The room went very still. Maeve kept her face turned away. She heard Silas stand up slowly. She heard Owen in the hallway make a sound she couldn't quite identify. And then she heard something she had not expected, something that made her turn around after all. Caleb was crying. He was standing in the hallway with his back against the wall and his arms crossed tight over his chest and his face turned up at the ceiling. And he was crying in the way that people cry when they have been holding something so long that the release of it is almost as violent, not loud, not theatrical. Just this shaking, helpless, private thing that he couldn't stop. She walked past Silas and past Owen, and she put her hand gently on Caleb's shoulder. He went rigid. She felt it the instinct to pull away, to put the walls back up, to be 8 years old and tough about it, the way he had been tough about everything for 2 years. Then he wasn't. Turned into her like a tree in wind, all at once, and he held on with both arms, and he shook, and she held him back, solid and steady. And she didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than the moment. She just held on. Silas watched from the doorway of June's room. Feel him there. She didn't look up. Owen pressed himself against Maeve's other side because he was 6 and he went where the warmth was. And she put her other arm around him, and the 3 of them stood in the cold hallway while the fire cracked in the other room, and June called from her cot for her rabbit, which Owen had left on the floor. It was not a happy family in any simple or tidy sense. The grief was still there, would always be there, occupying the shape of Evelyn Mercer like a shadow that moved through the rooms. The distances between them all were still real. Silas was still a man who kept himself at arm's length from everything that could hurt him, and Caleb was still a boy who had learned the same lesson too young, and Maeve was still sleeping in a room the size of a closet on a cot that complained every time she moved, and she was still, at the bottom of everything, the woman who had been purchased rather than chosen. None of that had changed. But something had shifted, in the way that weight shifts when you finally stop carrying it alone, not gone. Just redistributed, just a little more possible. She let Caleb go when he was ready to be let go. He stepped back and wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the floor, and she looked at the floor too and gave him that dignity. "Go get your sister's rabbit," she said. "It's on the floor in there." He went. He was glad to have something to do. Owen looked up at her. "Are you tired?" "Very," she said. "You should sleep." "I will." But she didn't, not right away. She went back to June's room and settled into the chair beside the cot and pulled her shawl around her shoulders and sat in the lamplight while June slept with her rabbit, and her breathing evened out and the fever stayed down. She sat there until the lamp burned low and the house went quiet around her, the real quiet of people sleeping, not the held breath quiet of people waiting for something terrible. Different sound. She was learning to tell the difference. When she finally got up to go to her own room, she passed through the kitchen and found, sit on the table, near the stove where it would stay warm, a covered plate. She lifted the cloth. Salt pork, biscuit, a cup of apple preserves. Silas had left it for her. She stood there looking at it for a moment. She ate alone at the kitchen table in the dark, listening to the wind, and she thought about the word June had used Mama Maeve, and she thought about the way Caleb had let himself be held, and she thought about Owen counting out the nutmeg over the soup pot with the absolute seriousness of someone performing an important task. She thought about the covered plate. She didn't know what any of it amounted to yet. She was too tired and too careful to call it anything it wasn't. But she knew this much. She had started the week as something that had been brought here to be useful, and she was ending it as something the children were afraid to lose. That was not nothing. She washed her plate and set it to dry, and went to her small room and lay down on the cot. And this time the springs didn't bother her because she was asleep before she could hear them. And she slept all the way through to the gray morning light without waking once. Outside the wind had stopped. The cold was still there, still deep and absolute in the way of Wyoming winter, but the worst of the storm had moved on. And somewhere between the barn and the house, in the mud and the frozen grass, a single set of boot prints led from the back door to the woodpile, and back Silas, checking the firewood in the night, making sure the supply would hold. He had made 2 trips. She found the tracks in the morning when she went to bring wood in for the kitchen stove. She stood and looked at them for a moment, 2 sets going out, 2 sets coming back, overlapping, careful. She picked up the wood and went inside. The kitchen was cold. She built the fire. By the time the sky had lightened enough to see the ridgeline, the house was warm, and the coffee was on, and the smell of it had reached. She knew every corner of every room, and one by one they would come down the stairs and find her here, the same as every other morning, steady and present, and entirely without the comfort of being asked for. Caleb came down first. He poured his own coffee without being offered. He sat in the chair closest to the stove instead of the chair farthest from her. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything at all. The chairs was closer. That was enough for now. Maeve turned back to the stove and started on the oatmeal, and the fire popped once behind the iron door. And somewhere upstairs, June laughed at some small 3-year-old thing that had tickled her, and the sound came down through the ceiling and spread through the kitchen like something released. Silas appeared in the doorway. He heard it too. She could tell by the way his expression changed for a half-second before he arranged it back into something manageable. He sat down. He took his coffee. "Much obliged," he said. She didn't answer. She just kept stirring. But she was. For the first time since Gideon Pike had counted $50 onto a kitchen table without once looking at her face, something she hadn't let herself be in a very long time. She was almost all right, turned out to be a moving target. The weeks after June's fever had a different quality to them than the weeks before. Not easier, exactly easier, was too simple a word for what happened in a house full of grief and adjustment, and 3 children who were each processing the presence of a stranger in their own complicated way. But there was more give in things, more room. The silences at the table weren't as loaded. Owen talked almost constantly now, filling every gap with questions and observations and small pieces of information he seemed to have been saving up his entire life for someone willing to listen. June called her May without self-consciousness and had developed a habit of bringing Maeve's small objects throughout the day, a smooth stone, a piece of ribbon, a dried flower she'd found pressed inside one of Evelyn's books, as though she were a bird building a nest, and Maeve was the center of it. Caleb was still Caleb. He didn't offer warmth the way his younger siblings did, and she didn't expect him to. But the chair had stayed closer to the stove. He had started finishing his meals without leaving the table first. Small things. She collected them, the way you collect firewood in early autumn, not because you need it yet, but because you know the cold is coming and you'd rather be ready. Silas remained the variable she couldn't calculate. He was not unkind. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, because there was a version of this situation that could become unkind very easily, and he had not let it. He worked hard, and he expected hard work in return, but he did not hold her to anything unreasonable. He fixed things when they broke without being asked a loose hinge on the pantry door, a window latch that hadn't closed properly since before she arrived, the cracked leg on the kitchen chair she'd been avoiding without realizing he'd noticed. She would find his repairs done silently, without comment, as if by someone who simply preferred action to conversation. She understood that. She preferred it herself, usually. But there were moments, quiet moments. In the evening particularly, when the children were in bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, when she would become aware of him in a room the way you become aware of weather. The weight of him. Not threatening, just present. She was very careful not to examine that feeling too closely. She had a role here. She had a function. She had come to understand, over the 6 weeks since that frozen wagon ride, that she could build something within those parameters, something that mattered. Something that was hers in the way a thing can be yours, even when you didn't choose it. The children were hers, in that sense. Not possessed, she wasn't Gideon Pike. She didn't think about people as possessions, but held. She held them, and they, in their different ways, held her back. That was enough. She told herself that was enough. Then February came in hard and sideways, and she discovered Evelyn's grave. She hadn't known where it was. She hadn't asked. It felt like the kind of question that would be answered when the person keeping the answer was ready to give it, and she had long since learned to wait on Silas' timeline. But she found it by accident on a gray afternoon, when she'd gone out further than usual to collect the last of the dried herbs she'd spotted growing along the eastern fence line. Chamomile gone to seed. Few stalks of something she thought might be yarrow, and she rounded the corner of the ridge's lower slope and almost walked into the wooden marker. It was a simple cross, rough-cut pine, and the name on it had been burned in rather than carved Evelyn Ruth Mercer and a year. The plot itself was tidy but stripped of anything living, the way graves go in winter, and there were no flowers, no tokens. Nothing to indicate that anyone had been here recently. Just the marker and the hard ground and the wind off the ridge. Maeve stood there for a while. She wasn't sure what she felt exactly. It wasn't pity. Evelyn didn't want her pity. She felt certain of that somehow. It was more like recognition. She had been circling this woman's life since the day she arrived, living in her house, cooking from her recipes, seeing her children's faces in every room, and she had never stood in a place that acknowledged her directly. She went back the following day with what she had. It was February, and there was almost nothing growing, but she found 3 stems of dried lavender. She'd hung in the kitchen and tied them with a strip of cloth and set them against the base of the cross. She brushed the loose ice off the top of the marker. She rearranged the rocks that edged the plot so they were even. She did not speak. She just worked steadily, the way she always worked. She was on her way back to the house when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her and turned to find Caleb standing 10 feet away, watching her. Her first instinct was to explain herself. She stopped it. He walked up to the grave and stood beside her and looked at what she'd done, the lavender, the straightened rocks, the brushed-off marker. His face was very still. "Nobody's been out here since autumn," he said. "I know. Papa can't." He stopped. Started again. "He doesn't come out here, I understand." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass around the plot and made a sound like something breathing. "She smelled like lavender," he said. "She dried it in the kitchen the same way you do." Maeve hadn't known that. She had hung the lavender because it was what she had, because it dried well and kept insects away from the linens. Coincidence hit her somewhere below the sternum. "I didn't know that," she said. "I'm glad I used it then." Caleb crouched down and touched the base of the cross with 2 fingers. Just touched it. Then he stood back up and looked at Maeve with an expression that was working very hard to stay flat and not entirely succeeding. "You're not trying to be her," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Maeve said. "I'm not her. I couldn't be, even if I tried. Some people would try. I know. It would be the wrong thing." Thought about that. He had his father's habit of processing things slowly and completely before responding, this boy, and she had learned to give him the space for it. She would have liked that you used the recipes, he said finally. She liked it when people used things instead of just keeping them. Maeve nodded. She didn't trust herself to say much. The nutmeg in the corn pudding, Caleb said. Owen told you about that. Mama taught him that. She said nutmeg made the difference between something that filled you up and something that you actually wanted. She was right. Caleb almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the doorway to one, briefly visible, and then gone. But it was the closest she had seen from him, and it was enough to make something ease in her chest that had been pulled tight for weeks. They walked back to the house, side by side without speaking, and when they came through the back door, Owen looked up from the table where he was doing his figures and said, "You both smell like cold." And Caleb knocked his pencil off the table on purpose. And the two of them argued about it in the automatic, low-stakes way of brothers who have been arguing about everything since before they could form full sentences. And Maeve put the kettle on and listened to them and didn't show what the last hour had done to her. But she was changed by it. She knew that. You don't stand at a woman's grave in February and hear her son tell you she smelled like lavender and walk away unchanged. She just didn't know yet what she'd been changed into. The answer began to clarify itself on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of February. Silas had ridden into the nearest town, a 2-hour trip each way for supplies, and a meeting with a man named Aldous Fitch, who was something to do with the water rights on the creek that bordered the southern edge of Mercer Land. He'd told her he'd be back by supper. She had supper ready, and he was not back, and she kept it warm and put the children to bed and kept it warmer and told herself he was fine, that men were delayed all the time for ordinary reasons, that the trail could be slow in the cold. He came back at 9:30 with his jaw set and his eyes the color of something that had been standing in wind too long. She didn't ask right away. She took his coat and hung it on its hook and set his supper in front of him and poured his coffee and waited until he'd had several minutes with the food before she said, from across the kitchen, "What happened?" He ate another bite, chewed, swallowed. "Fitch says the creek runs through land he's claiming," Scylla said. "Says there was a boundary error in my deed from 12 years back, and he's had it surveyed, and the survey puts the creek on his side." Maeve set down the cloth she'd been folding. "What does that mean for the cattle?" "It means if Fitch is right, I've been drawing water from his land for 12 years, and I've got no claim to it going forward. It means the south pasture's useless without that water, and the south pasture is where I winter the main herd." He stopped. "It means I'm in serious trouble." She sat down across from him. This was not a moment for the careful distance she usually maintained. "Do you have your deed?" "Yes." "And a plat map?" He looked at her with a slight narrowing of the eyes. "You know about plat maps? My father was a surveyor for 6 years before he farmed. I grew up watching him draw them. I know what they're for, and I know that a boundary dispute requires you to have your original documents to counter any claim about a survey error." She held his gaze. "Do you have them?" Silas was quiet for a moment. He put his fork down. "I have the deed," he said. "The plat map came with the original land grant. It's in the strong box in my office." "Have you looked at it recently?" "Not in years." "Then you need to look at it. Before you respond to Fitch, before you talk to anyone, before you do anything else, you need to look at what you actually have and understand it. Because a man who claims there's been a survey error is counting on you not knowing your own documents well enough to challenge him." Silas stared at her. She could not entirely read the stare. It was somewhere between surprise and something else. Something that had more weight to it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You've said as much before. Through implication. I meant it as a... I'm not trying to..." He stopped himself, rubbed the side of his jaw. "I don't know what I'm trying to say." "Then don't say it tonight," she said. "Get the deed and the plat map out before you sleep. We can look at them in the morning when the light's better." He nodded slowly. She got up and started cleaning up the kitchen, and he sat at the table for another few minutes with his coffee. And she was aware of him watching her again, that weather awareness she had developed, and was careful not to examine, and she kept her back to him and kept working. "I'll get the map," he said. He did. He set it on the corner of the kitchen table that night and left it there for morning. What followed over the next several days was something she hadn't anticipated, a collaboration. Not comfortable, not easy, but real. She went through the plat map inch by inch, tracing the boundary lines with a careful finger, cross-referencing them against the deed language. Her father had taught her to read a plat map, the way some fathers taught their daughters to read music not as a professional skill but as a way of understanding the world you inhabited, of knowing what you owned and where it ended. What she found took her 2 days to be certain of. The survey Fitch had commissioned showed the creek falling 6 yards east of where the original plat marked the boundary. But the original plat had a datum point of fixed reference, a particular rock formation on the northern ridge that any new survey would have to anchor from. The new survey had used a different datum. The entire measurement would shift. The datum, she said to Silas on the second evening. This mark here. She pointed to a small notation in the corner of the plat. This is what everything is measured from. If Fitch's surveyor used a different starting point, then the whole thing's wrong, Silas said. He was leaning over her shoulder, close enough that she could hear him exhale slowly when he understood what she was showing him. Not necessarily wrong by accident, she said. The silence that followed had a specific texture. You think Fitch told him which datum to use, Silas said. I think it's worth asking the question. And I think before you do anything about Fitch, you need someone to free survey from the correct datum and get that result documented. Silas straightened up. He looked at the map. He looked at her. Where did you learn? My father, she said. I told you. You told me he was a surveyor. You didn't tell me you paid attention. Most people assume I didn't, she said. It came out flatter than she intended. She picked up the map and began rolling it carefully. I'll get you the name of the notation. You'll want to give it to whoever you hire to resurvey. She felt his hand close gently over her wrist. Not hard. Just there, Maeve. She went still. Thank you, he said. Not the usual 2 words, not much obliged, delivered like a line from a script. This was different, deliberate. He said it like he meant the specific shape of it. She didn't look at him. She wasn't ready for that. Don't thank me until we know if it works, she said. He let go of her wrist. She finished rolling the map. The resurvey took 3 weeks to arrange and execute, and in the meantime, Fitch sent a man out to the ranch, a lawyer from Cheyenne, with new boots and no understanding of winter mud, who stood in the kitchen and talked at Silas for 40 minutes about outlawments and contested claims and the legal cost, pursuing a boundary dispute in the territory courts. Maeve stayed in the back of the kitchen and said nothing. The lawyer noticed her once, glanced at her, the way men like him glanced at women in kitchens, and returned his attention entirely to Silas. Poured coffee. She listened to every word. When the lawyer left, she told Silas everything she'd identified as a pressure point in the man's argument. 3 specific claims that rested on assumptions about the original deed language that the deed didn't actually support. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting, which was itself a change from 6 weeks ago when she suspected he might have interrupted. You should have been a lawyer, he said when she finished. Women don't get to be lawyers. I know. I'm saying you should have been one anyway. She looked at him sideways. That's a strange kind of compliment. I'm a strange kind of man, he said, without any humor in it, just matter of fact, the way he said most things. She almost laughed. Almost. The resurvey confirmed what she had suspected. Fitch's surveyor had anchored from a different datum, not the rock formation specified in the original land grant, but a fence post that had been put in sometime in the last decade. Everything measured from that post shifted the boundary 6 yards east, conveniently enough to put the creek on Fitch's side. Measured from the original datum, the creek sat squarely within Mercer land, where it had always been. Silas took the new survey to Cheyenne himself. He was gone 3 days. Those 3 days had their own particular difficulty. She had not realized, until his absence, how much of the ranch's functioning depended on the specific way she and Silas had developed around each other, not warmly, not with any kind of expressed affection, but practically the way two people working the same ground develop a rhythm. Without him, the rhythm broke, and she found herself doing things she didn't usually do, filling some spaces he occupied, and somewhere in that, she understood something about herself that she hadn't wanted to understand. She had gotten used to him, not the way you get used to a piece of furniture that's always in the same place. The way you get used to someone whose presence in a room changes the temperature of it slightly, whose movements you track without meaning to, whose opinion even given in monosyllables and carefully managed expressions you find yourself waiting for. She did not like this understanding. She set it aside very firmly and spent the 3 days reorganizing the pantry and mending everything that needed mending and teaching Owen to play checkers with the set she'd found in the hall cabinet, which kept both of them occupied and didn't leave room for thinking. Caleb, who noticed everything, noticed her. "You keep looking at the door," he said on the second evening. "No, I don't, you do. Every time there's a sound outside." "I'm listening for weather," she said. "There's a storm coming." He looked at her with 8-year-old skepticism, so complete it was almost insulting. "There isn't a storm coming," he said. "It's clear." "Caleb, I'm just saying." "I know what you're just saying," she said. "And I'm telling you to find something else to observe." He went back to his book with the particular satisfaction of a child who has made his point without having to defend it. Silas came back on the evening of the third day, with the boundary confirmed in the territory's records and Fitch's claim formally rejected. He came through the door with mud on his boots and a tiredness around his eyes that went deeper than 3 days of riding, and the children descended on him immediately, Owen with questions, June with her arms up demanding to be carried, even Caleb drifting into the front room with his book still in his hand. Maeve stayed in the kitchen. She heard his voice through the wall, low, patient, answering Owen's questions, making June laugh about something, a whole register of him she only ever heard through walls and doorways. Kept her hands busy with the supper dishes. He'd appeared in the kitchen doorway after the children had gone on up. "It's settled," he said. "I heard. I'm glad." He came in and poured himself water from the pitcher and drank half of it standing at the counter. He looked more tired up close than he had in the doorway. "The man at the land office," he said. He asked who'd identified the datum discrepancy. I told him. "She kept washing dishes." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Whoever she is, she saved you the ranch.'" "She didn't say anything." "He's not wrong," Silas said. She set the last dish on the draining board and dried her hands and turned around. He was watching her from across the kitchen with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not quite the careful blankness, not quite the managed grief. Something else. Something that looked like it had gotten past the managed parts. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. "I'm glad it worked out," she said. "The resurvey cost wasn't too much?" "No." "Good. Then we're all right for now." She picked up her lamp from the counter. "I'll see you in the morning," she said. She went to her room. She lay down on the cot and listened to the house settle around her Silas, moving through the kitchen, checking the stove damper the way he did every night, his boots on the floor, creak of the hallway. Then quiet. She stared at the ceiling. She was not going to be foolish about this. She understood her position here clearly, and she had understood it from the beginning, and nothing that had happened to children, the grave, the boundary dispute, the warm plate left on the table after June's fever, none of it changed the fundamental structure of what she was. She had been purchased. She was useful. She was here because she was useful. And she would stay here because she was useful. And she needed to keep those facts in the front of her thinking and not let anything else crowd in. She told herself this very firmly. She almost believed it. The trouble with almost believing something is that the part you don't believe tends to operate anyway, quietly, in whatever rooms you're not paying attention to. She was not paying attention the afternoon. She heard the voices in the barn. It was a Wednesday, clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming afternoon, where the light had a quality to it, like something poured rather than shone. She had gone out to check on the feed for the horses, a task she'd taken on over the last few weeks because Silas was overwhelmed with fence work on the south pasture now that the boundary dispute was settled and the ground was becoming workable again. Came around the corner of the barn and heard male voices inside, and stopped before she pushed through the door, not out of any deliberate eavesdropping instinct, but because she was moving quietly in the mud and they simply hadn't heard her. She recognized Silas's voice. The other was a man she hadn't seen before, rough-edged, older, someone who used words like he was getting paid by how hard they landed. Didn't think you'd actually do it, the other man was saying. There was a laugh in it, not a kind one. Going out and buying yourself a young one. A silence. Then Silas's voice, flat. It's not like that. Like hell it ain't. How much d'you pay for her? Another silence. Longer. Maeve stood outside the barn door in the cold and did not move. I needed someone to keep the house and look after the children, Silas said. This is. That right. The man made a sound she couldn't quite characterize. Must be convenient, having one that young. Can't be too hard on the eyes either, I'd guess. It's your mouth. I'm just saying what everyone in town is thinking. Man your age widow with 3 kids goes and buys himself a girl of 18 to run his household. People aren't ignorant, Silas. They see it for what it is. Then they're wrong, Silas said. His voice had gone to a particular quality she recognized, the voice he used when he had decided something and was not going to be moved. She came because I needed help with the children and the house. Convenient. That's all this is. She convenient. The 2 words landed with the precision of something dropped from a height. She took 1 step back from the door, then another. She did not wait to hear the rest of the conversation. She did not want to hear the rest of it. She had heard the part that mattered, the part that answered the question. She had been carefully not asking herself for weeks, and the answer was exactly what she should have expected from the beginning, and somehow had not entirely let herself expect. Convenient. She walked back to the house. She went through the back door and into the kitchen and stood at the counter with both hands flat on the wood and breathed in and breathed out and stared at the wall. She thought about the covered plate left warm on the table after June's fever broke. She thought about his hand on her wrist when he said, "Thank you," in a way that meant it. She thought about Caleb telling her she kept looking at the door. She pressed her palms harder against the counter until she could feel the grain of the wood. Then she straightened up. She went to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen, where she kept her papers, a habit she'd developed, maintaining a household ledger, tracking expenses and supplies so Silas could account for what things cost. Took out a sheet of paper. She found the pencil. She sat down and wrote. She wrote slowly and carefully because she had learned in the last 2 months that slow and careful was the only way she knew how to survive anything. And she read it back when she was done, and it said what she meant it to say, and nothing more and nothing less. Folded it. She went to the mudroom. The leather belt was still hanging on its hook, the repaired one, with the M scratched into the inside, the one she had found in the first week and not asked about. She stood looking at it for a moment. She took it down. She carried both things, the letter and the belt, back to her room, and she set them on the cot, and she sat beside them in the last of the afternoon light and looked at them and thought about what she was going to do. The fire was burning in the kitchen. She could smell the supper she'd started before she'd gone to the barn. She could hear Owen upstairs arguing with Caleb about something. She could hear June talking to her rabbit in the particular one-sided way of 3-year-olds, conducting very serious conversations. She sat for a long time. Outside, the sky went from pale to gray to the deep, specific dark of a Wyoming night coming on fast and cold, and the wind started up again off the ridge. And somewhere between the barn and the house, she could hear Silas's footsteps crossing the yard, coming toward the back door, coming home the way he came home every evening at this hour, steady and certain and entirely unaware that anything had changed. She stood up. She picked up her mother's mirror off the nail and wrapped it in her spare dress. She put the book with the repaired spine on top. She put her wool stockings next to it. She packed what she could carry. She had done this before. She knew how long it took, and she knew what it felt like to do it, and she did it anyway. Because there was no world in which Maeve Holloway, who had been sold by one man and told by another that she was merely convenient, merely useful, merely a function in a household, could stay in a place that confirmed what she had spent her entire life being told she was. She would not be convenient. She was not convenient. She wrote the word down in her mind and looked at it hard and crossed it out. Back door opened. She heard him in the kitchen. She heard him go still when he found the empty stove. She heard him call her name once, and then again, and then the sound of him moving through the house, checking rooms, his footsteps changing from question to something she recognized even through walls and closed doors, as the sound of a man who has just understood that something he needed, really needed, not just in the useful, convenient sense, is gone. Picked up her bag. She looked around the small room, the hook where her mirror had been, the windowsill where her book had sat. She picked up the belt. She carried it to the kitchen table where the letter was, and she laid the belt across the folded letter. She did not know why. She just felt that she should leave him the thing he had fixed. The thing he had fixed, simply because it was hers, because it had needed fixing, because that was what he did. She wanted him to see it next to the letter. She wanted him to know she had noticed. Then she opened the back door and she walked out into the Wyoming dark, and the cold came up around her immediately, like something waiting, and behind her she could hear Owen calling her name from upstairs, not knowing yet, and June echoing it without understanding. And the sound of them followed her across the yard, and then the wind took it, and she put her head down and kept walking. He found the letter first. He hadn't gone upstairs to quiet the children, yet he'd heard Owen calling Maeve's name and June echoing it, and something in the sound of it, some quality of growing panic in Owen's voice, had sent him directly to the kitchen instead, some instinct pulling him toward the center of things, rather than the source of the noise. He stood at the table and saw the belt lying across the folded paper, and he stood very still for a moment before he picked it up. He knew the belt. He had repaired it 3 weeks after Maeve arrived, not because she asked him to. She hadn't asked him for anything, had barely spoken to him about anything that wasn't the children or the house, but because he had found it in the mudroom where she'd hung it cracked nearly through, near the buckle, and he had sat with it on the workbench in the barn for an hour one evening, doing the repair without quite being able to explain to himself why it mattered that it be done. It was a small belt. It belonged to her. It needed fixing. He set the belt aside and opened the letter. He read it twice, the second time more slowly. She had written in a hand that was careful and completely steady, not a single crossed word, not a single correction, and the words she'd chosen were simple and direct, in the way that only words written by someone who has thought very precisely about what they mean can be. She wrote that she refused to remain in a place where her presence amounted to convenience. She wrote that she had understood, from the beginning, the nature of the arrangement, but that she had allowed herself to believe foolishly, she wrote, her word that it had become something else. She wrote that she was sorry for the disruption to the household, and that the children deserved better than to wake in the morning and find her gone without warning, and that she was sorry for that specifically and not for the leaving itself. She signed it with her full name, Maeve Holloway. Not Maeve, not Miss Holloway. Her whole name, the way you sign something official, the way you sign something final. Silas stood at the kitchen table with the letter in one hand and the belt in the other, and he thought about the man in the barn. Ed Granger. Old Hand worked the Valley Circuit, a man who had known Silas since before Evelyn, since before the children, since before any of this, and who had developed over decades the kind of confidence that comes from being large and loud and consistently unchallenged. He'd ridden in that afternoon wanting work, and Silas had been going to tell him he didn't have anything steady to offer. And instead, Ed had started talking about Maeve with that particular smirk, that men like him are reserved for situations they thought they understood. And Silas had said the wrong thing. He had said the wrong thing because he was angry not at Maeve, not at Ed Granger exactly, but at the whole situation, at the way the conversation was going. The implication, in Ed's voice, that Silas had done something shameful or base when what he had done was put the letter down. What had he done, exactly? He had purchased a woman. He had driven her 4 hours in the cold to his house and given her a small room and a list of tasks and nothing else. And somewhere in the 10 weeks since then, she had become not a housekeeper, not a caretaker, not the function he had assigned her. She had become the person his children ran to, person who had saved June's life with wet cloth and determination, and 3 sleepless nights. The person who had found the datum discrepancy in a plat map that 3 men with legal training had missed, person who had knelt in February mud to straighten the rocks around Evelyn's grave and left lavender against the cross. He had called her convenient. He had said it in a barn to a man he didn't even like, to shut down a conversation he didn't want to be having, to protect her reputation from the kind of talk that Ed Granger would spread through the valley like contamination. And he had done it so badly, so completely wrong, that she had heard the words stripped of everything else and taken them as the truth of what he thought. He was out the back door before he had consciously decided to move. Owen was at the top of the stairs calling down. "Papa, where is she? Maeve isn't—" "Stay inside," Silas said. "Both of you stay inside and keep June with you." "But where Owen?" His voice came out harder than he meant it to. Inside now. He heard Owen go quiet. He heard Caleb's voice, lower, saying something to his brother. He trusted Caleb to manage the next 20 minutes, and he moved across the yard toward the barn, because he needed the horse. And he needed it fast. He saddled in less than 3 minutes, which was probably a record, and he came out of the barn at a pace that was not quite reckless but close enough. The night was clear and cold, and the moon was up and throwing enough light that he could see the trail heading east toward the road, the only logical direction she would go. Because west was deeper into the range, and north was the ridge, and south was the Fitch property. And she would know that she had learned the land well enough to know that. He found her tracks in the soft mud at the edge of the yard. She had a good 20-minute lead on him, maybe more. He urged the horse east. The cold was the kind that worked its way through layers. She had her coat he had checked. Her coat was gone from its hook, but she'd left in the early evening with no particular plan. No horse, no clear destination, which meant she was moving on determination alone. She was good at that. He had learned that about her. Determination was a thing she carried the way. Other people carried tools. Found her in 30 minutes. She was not where he expected. She had cut south of the main trail, following the creek bed, which was both sensible and telling. She knew the creek was on Mercer land now. She knew it because she was the one who had proven it. He spotted her from the ridge above, her dark coat against the snow-patched ground, moving steadily, not running, just walking with her head down and her bag on her shoulder. He came down off the ridge, carefully. The horse didn't love that slope, in the dark, and by the time he reached the creek level, she had heard him and stopped. She didn't run. He had not expected her to run. She turned and watched him ride up, and her face in the moonlight was very still and very cold. And there was nothing in it that looked like relief. He got down from the horse. He did not immediately speak. He stood there in the snow with the reins in his hand, and he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the creek moved quietly between its frozen edges, and above them, the Wyoming sky was enormous and indifferent and full of stars. "You need to come back," he said. "No," she said. "I don't. The children don't." Her voice was level. But there was something in it that he recognized as the edge of something larger, held firmly back. "Don't put the children in front of me as a reason. You know as well as I do that they will manage. Children manage." Closed his mouth. She shifted the bag on her shoulder and looked past him toward the trail. "I'm not trying to make this difficult for you. I understand what you need, and I'm sorry that my leaving creates a problem. But I am not," she stopped, drew a breath. "I will not stay somewhere that I am simply a solution to a problem. I knew what I was when I came here. I was $50. I understood that. But somewhere in the last 10 weeks I forgot to keep understanding it, and that was my mistake, and I am correcting it. It wasn't a mistake, he said. Don't, Maeve. I heard you, she said. In the barn. I wasn't trying to hear you. Came to check the feed, and I heard you, and I heard what you said. So please don't stand here in the cold and tell me I misunderstood, because I know what the word convenient means, and I know how you used it. The word fell between them like a stone into the creek. He felt it land. I know what you heard, he said. Good. I know what it sounded like. Then you know why I'm standing here instead of in your kitchen. He took 2 steps toward her, and she didn't step back, which he counted as something. She stood her ground and watched him come and kept her chin up and her jaw set, and she looked furious and cold and tired, and about 18 years old, which she was, kept forgetting because she functioned like someone with decades behind her. Ed Granger has been running his mouth through this valley since before you were born, Silas said. He came to the barn today, looking for work, and when I didn't give it to him immediately, he started talking about you. The way he talks about things he doesn't understand, and people he doesn't respect. And I said what I said because I wanted to shut him down, and I didn't. He stopped, started again. I didn't think about how it sounded by itself, without everything else. I was trying to make him lose interest, and I did it the wrong way, and you heard the wrong thing, stripped of the reason for it. She was very quiet. That's not an excuse, he said. What I said was still wrong. Even if Granger never talked, even if no one was listening, that word. He shook his head. You're not convenient. You've been a great many things in this house since October, and not one of them is that word. What have I been then? She asked, not challenging. Genuinely asking which was harder. He was not a man who talked about things. He had never been that man. Evelyn had understood that about him and worked around it, and sometimes resented it. He knew, though she'd been too patient to say so often. He did not have a long vocabulary for interior things. He understood land and livestock and weather and the kind of problems that could be solved with physical work, and he had spent 2 years after Evelyn's death being grateful for problems of that kind because they left no room for the other kind. It was us standing in front of him, in the snow, asking him a direct question, and she deserved a direct answer, and he was going to give her one, even if it came out badly shaped. You've been the reason the house sounds different, he said. Been the reason. June laughs like she used to. You've been the reason. Owen eats a full meal instead of just moving food around his plate. You've been the reason Caleb stopped carrying everything by himself. He paused. You've been the reason I stopped. He stopped himself. She waited. He made himself say it. You've been the reason I stopped being afraid to come inside at the end of the day. Silence stretched long enough that he heard the creek moving and the horse shifting its weight behind him and the wind in the distance starting to build. I didn't know I was doing that, she said quietly. I know you didn't. That's how I know it was real. She looked at him, really looked, not the careful, managed look she usually gave him. He held it. He was not accustomed to being seen, and he didn't particularly enjoy the sensation, but he held it because she deserved that too. You lost your wife, she said, and I understand that you closed things up. I understand why. I watched you do it from across every room I was in for 10 weeks, and I never said anything about it because it wasn't my place, and it still isn't. But I need you to hear what I'm saying to you right now. She shifted the bag again, a small, involuntary movement, and he realized she was colder than she was letting on. I never needed you to love me. I never expected that. I didn't come here expecting anything, but I need to matter. Not because I'm useful, not because I solve problems. Because I am a person, and I walked into your house and gave everything I had to those children and to that land, and to... She stopped. I needed to matter for that, just for that. He stepped forward again. This time he reached out careful, deliberate, and he took the bag from her shoulder and set it in the sits of snow, without putting it down entirely, just took the weight of it. You do, he said. You matter. More than I've been able to say, and more than I knew how to show you, and I am sorry that I let you stand in a barn doorway and hear something that told you otherwise. She looked at the bag in his hand. I don't know how to be what you might want me to be, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a man who talks well or feels things neatly. close up when I should open, and I fix things with my hands when I should use words instead. I know these things about myself, and I don't know how much of them I can change." He looked at her steadily. "But I know that when I found that letter on the table, I couldn't feel my hands for a minute. And I know I rode out here in the dark, and I want to ride back with you. Not because you're convenient. Not because I need the house kept. Because that ranch, that cold, broken-down grieving place, is different when you're in it. And so am I." She was very still. He waited. "You said those words to Granger," she said finally. "You chose those words, I did. I chose wrong. If I come back," she stopped. "If I come back, I need you to understand that I am not a solution. I'm not something you acquired and kept running. If I come back, it's because I choose to come back. And that's a different thing entirely." "Yes," he said, "it is, and I need the children to know that. Not in a formal way, not in some declaration. Just I need to know that you see the difference. See it." She looked at him for a long moment, could not read everything in her face. There was more in it than he had access to. Yet, and he suspected there was more in her than he had access to in general. More than he had made any real effort to know, and he felt the weight of that failure without quite having the words for it. "My hands are very cold," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his gloves, the thick ones lined with sheepskin, and held them out to her. She looked at them. She looked at him. She took them. They were too large for her, and she put them on anyway, and the sight of her standing there with his oversized gloves on, and her chin still up, and her bag in his hand, was something he didn't have a category for, and wasn't going to try to create one for right now. "I'll walk," she said. "If you lead the horse, it's 1.5 miles. I know how far it is. I just walked it." He almost said something about the cold and stopped himself because she knew about the cold and she had made her choice and he was going to respect it. He picked up her bag and hung it from the saddle horn. He took the horse by the reins and they started back along the creek, and neither of them spoke for the first several minutes. The moon was directly overhead now, and the ground was silver and black, and the cold had that particular Wyoming quality of being total, of filling every space you left unguarded. She was the first to speak. "What did Granger want?" "Work, general ranch hand. I told him I didn't have anything steady. You should have told him that." Before he had a chance to say anything else. "Yes," he said. "I should have. Is he going to be trouble?" "Granger talks. That's all he does. I'm not worried about Granger. People talking creates its own kind of trouble." "Let them talk," Silas said. "There isn't anything they can say about this house that isn't answered by what this house actually is." She was quiet for a moment. "And what is it?" He thought about this seriously, in the way he approached most things slowly, completely. "It's a place that was dying," he said, "and isn't anymore." He felt more than heard her exhale slowly. They walked the rest of the distance in a silence that was different from the earlier silences, not empty, not loaded, just two people covering ground together in the dark, which was, he thought, probably the most honest version of anything that had happened between them so far. Owen was at the back door. He had not stayed inside. He was standing on the porch with Caleb's coat thrown over his own and his socks on and no boots. And when he saw Maeve come around the corner of the barn, his whole face did something enormous and uncontrolled that he didn't even try to manage. "You came back," he said. "I came back," she said. "I was going to come find you. I know you were." She went up the porch steps and she put her hand on his face briefly, just for a second, palm against his cold cheek, and he leaned into it the way June leaned into everything, automatic and unguarded. "Go inside. You don't have boots on, I know." "Owen." He went inside. She followed him. Caleb was at the top of the stairs. He was looking down at her, with his arms crossed, and his face in its careful arrangement, but his eyes were doing what they always did when his face was lying about how he felt, which was giving everything away. "You forgot your mirror," he said. She looked up at him. She almost laughed. "I didn't forget it. I took it with me, still on the wall." She paused. She had been so certain she'd packed it. She thought back and realized she had wrapped it in her dress, and then unwrapped it again when she needed the dress and set it on the windowsill. And then, I forgot my mirror, she said. I know, Caleb said. He unfolded his arms. June's awake. She heard Owen and she's been crying. I'll go to her. She went up the stairs and Caleb moved out of her way and then fell into step behind her, which was the most natural thing in the world and entirely unremarkable in the way that only significant things can be when they're happening to people who don't yet know how to name them. Silas came in through the back door and stood in the kitchen and listened. To the house above him, June settling, Owen's voice, Caleb's quieter undertone, and then Maeve's, the steady and low and present, put the kettle on. He found the letter on the table, where he'd left it, and he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He didn't know why exactly. He just felt like it was something to keep rather than discard, the way you keep evidence of something true. He stood at the stove while the kettle heated, and he thought about what she had said. I never needed you to love me. I just needed to matter. He thought about 10 weeks of watching her from doorways and across tables and through kitchen windows. 10 weeks of much obliged and careful distance, and telling himself that keeping his distance was the right thing, the responsible thing, the only safe thing for a man who had already learned exactly how much losing someone could cost. He thought about Evelyn. This was not something he let himself do often. He had parceled out the grief into manageable portions, dealt with it in increments, allowed himself to feel it only when he could afford to feel it, which was almost never. He missed her. He missed her specifically, not the idea of her particular patience with him, the way she could read a room in 2 seconds flat, the sound she made when she was thinking hard about something, this low hum under her breath, the way she had loved Caleb before he was born and had known somehow that he would be serious and watchful and would need to be held to a specific standard, or he would use his intelligence to make himself very lonely. She had been right about that. She'd been right about most things. He thought about Maeve standing at Evelyn's grave in February, straightening rocks in the mud. He thought about what it cost someone to do a thing like that, for a woman they'd never met, a woman whose shadow they'd been living inside since October, without being asked, without telling anyone, without turning it into something that earned them credit. Poured the tea when the kettle was ready. He made 4 cups, put 2 on a tray and carried them upstairs. Maeve was sitting on the edge of June's small bed when he pushed the door open. June was in her lap, mostly asleep again, one fist twisted in the fabric of Maeve's coat, which she hadn't taken off yet. Owen was cross-legged on the floor. Caleb was leaning against the wall with his arms across his chest, not quite asleep but getting there. Silas set the tray on the dresser without speaking. He handed a cup to Maeve. She took it with both hands. He looked at his children in the lamplight. Owen's eyes had closed. Caleb was watching him from under lowered lids. June breathed against Maeve's shoulder, slow and warm. He sat down in the chair by the dresser. None of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying right now, and he was, despite everything, a man who understood the right use of silence. After a while, Caleb said, without opening his eyes all the way, "You're going to let her stay." It was not a question. "If she wants to stay," Cecily said. "She wants to," Owen said from the floor, drowsy. Matter of fact, entirely confident. Maeve said nothing, but her hands were around the cup and her shoulders had come down from where she'd been holding them. And June slept on her chest like something that had found the right place to be. And Silas watched the lamplight move on the wall and felt something ease inside him that had not eased in 2 years. Not fixed, not resolved, not the neat and complete healing of something broken, just eased. Enough to breathe a little differently. He sat with them until both younger children were fully asleep, and Caleb's breathing had slowed. And then he stood up and he looked at Maeve in the lamplight. She was tired, he could see it. Now that her guard was lower, the deep bone tired of someone who had been running on will for a long time. "Sleep," he said. "Everything else can wait until morning." She nodded once. He went to the door. He stopped. "Maeve." He said her name the way he'd said it on the creek bank, not as a summons, just as itself. "I'm glad you came back." She looked at him. "I haven't decided if I'm glad yet," she said. "Ask me in the morning." He almost smiled. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle into sleep around him. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about the letter in his coat pocket and about a woman who had packed her mirror and forgotten to take it and walked 1.5 miles into a Wyoming night because she needed to matter, just to matter, and how he had almost let her go because he was afraid of the cost of keeping her. He thought about cost. He had been calculating cost for 2 years, the cost of feeling, the cost of opening, the cost of letting something matter enough to hurt you when it left. He had become very economical about it. He had reduced his life to things that cost predictable amounts, cattle and land and water rights, and children who needed feeding and a house that needed knowable expenses, manageable losses. She had walked into that economy and simply refused to function within it. She had sat with his dying daughter for 3 nights and identified a fraudulent land survey and knelt in February mud to straighten rocks on a grave that wasn't her grief to carry. And she had done all of it not because she was paid for it or because she was told to, but because she was Maeve Holloway, and that was apparently how she moved through the world toward things that needed tending without waiting to be asked. He put his hand over his coat pocket where the letter was. Thought, I have been very stupid about this for a very long time. Then he thought, I have time to be less stupid. If she's still here in the morning. In the morning she was there. She was at the stove when he came down. She had her back to him, and she was making oatmeal, and her mirror was back on its nail above the washstand. In her room he had seen the light catch it when he passed the open door, and her book was back on the windowsill, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and something warm. She heard him come in, and she said, without turning around, I decided I'm glad. Poured his coffee. Good, he said. He sat down, put a bowl in front of him. He picked up his spoon, and outsides, for the first time in what felt like months, the Wyoming sky had gone blue, a real blue, not the white-gray of winter, but the deep particular blue that meant the back of the cold was breaking, that the turn was coming, that whatever had been held in suspension by the freeze was getting ready to move. He looked out the window at that sky, and he thought about what was still undone between them, still unnamed, still unmoved, still living in the careful space they'd made around each other. It was not settled. He knew it wasn't settled, but it was different now, in a way that couldn't be undone. And different was something, and something was where everything real had always started. The oatmeal was hot, and the coffee was strong, and the house above them was beginning to stir, small footsteps, and small voices crossing the ceiling. 8. She stood at the stove and drank her coffee. The sky outside went on being blue. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. 3 warm days followed by a freeze. Mud that froze overnight and thawed by noon. Creek running fast and cold with snowmelt. The south pasture greening in patches while the north ridge held its white. It was not the clean seasonal turn that people who had never lived through a mountain winter imagined when they thought about spring. It was a negotiation, slow and contested, and some mornings you woke up and could not tell which side was winning. Maeve had learned to read it. She knew now when the air had that particular quality that meant the temperature would hold, when the light coming through the kitchen window had weight to it instead of just cold brightness. She had lived through one Wyoming winter, and it had changed the way she understood her own body, what it meant to be genuinely warm versus merely not freezing, what real rest felt like after months of sleeping with one ear open for changes in the weather and the children. She was not the same person who had climbed into Silas Mercer's wagon in October. She had known that for a while. The knowing had come gradually, the way most true things came to her, not in a single revelation, but in accumulation, in the slow weight of small things adding up. She had changed. The house had changed. The children had changed. And Silas, in the careful and incremental way of a man who distrusted change on principle, had changed too. They did not talk about what had happened on the creek bank in February. Not directly. That was not the way either of them operated. She was learning that about herself as much as about him, that she was a person who processed things through action rather than language, who needed to live inside a truth for a while before she could put words to it. But it was there, present in the space between them, acknowledged in the way that things are acknowledged between two people who have agreed, without discussing it so meant that some things don't need to be said to be real. He had stopped saying much obliged. She noticed it about a week after she came back. He started saying thank you instead. Actual thank you. The two syllables with the shape of meaning in them. And it was such a small shift, and she was so careful not to make anything of it that she almost convinced herself she was imagining it. But she wasn't. She had learned the precise vocabulary of his silences and his limited expressions, and she was not imagining this. In March, he started sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, instead of going directly to his office after supper. He did not make conversation exactly. He brought things to work on harness to mend, accounts to go over, whatever task transferred easily to a kitchen table, and he sat on his side of the table, and she sat on hers, with her mending or her book, and they occupied the same room, in a way that felt, after a while, less like two people tolerating each other, and more like two people who had found a rhythm they didn't want to break. Owen was delighted by this. He began scheduling himself into the evenings, deliberately, manufacturing reasons to stay downstairs, asking questions about the accounts that he was far too young to need answers to, offering opinions on the harness repair that Silas received with more patience than Owen deserved. Caleb would sometimes appear in the doorway, assess the situation, and either join or not, depending on some internal calculation that remained opaque to everyone but himself. June simply climbed into laps without asking whose. It was one of those evenings in late March, the fire going the lamp warm. June asleep against Maeve's side with her head on a folded quilt when Silas set down the account book and said, "Without preamble, I want to take you somewhere tomorrow, if you're willing." She looked up from her book. He was looking at her directly, which he did more often now, which still sometimes required a moment of adjustment. "Where?" she asked. "The East Meadow, past the ridge." He paused. "Where Evelyn's ashes are." She was very still. "It's where things bloom first," he said. "Every year. It's where the wildflowers come in, before anywhere else on the property." She picked it for that reason. Maeve set her book face down on the table. June shifted against her and resettled. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded. He picked up the account book again, but something had shifted in the room, not tension exactly. More like the feeling after a door has been opened, in a house that's been closed up all winter, when the outside air comes in and everything rearranges itself slightly around the new element. They went the next morning, just the two of them, while Caleb watched the younger children. It was a clear day, cold still but with real warmth in the sun, and the trail to the East Meadow went up through a stand of bare-branched cottonwoods and came out suddenly into the open and natural bowl, south-facing, protected on three sides by the ridge and open to the sky. On the fourth, and the grass here was already fully green, and across the floor of the bowl, where the sun hit longest, there were wildflowers. Not many yet, not the full bloom that was still weeks off, but enough. Yellow and white and a deep persistent blue that had no right to be there in late March, except that this particular meadow made its own rules about such things. She understood immediately why Evelyn had chosen it. They stood at the edge of the meadow for a moment without speaking. She could feel him beside her, not touching, not close enough for that, but present in the specific way she had become attuned to, that weather awareness that she had stopped, trying not to have. He reached into his coat pocket and he took out something small and held it without showing it to her for a moment, as if he needed to hold it a little longer before he could let it go. Then he opened his hand. It was a necklace, a strand of small pearls on a fine chain with a delicate clasp that had been repaired. At some point she could see the newer work at the joint. Old, well made. The kind of thing that had been in a family for a generation before becoming an heirloom. "My mother's," he said. "She gave it to Evelyn when we married. Evelyn wore it once for the wedding, and then put it away because she was afraid of losing it." A pause. "She said things you were afraid of losing shouldn't be locked up." She said that about a lot of things. He looked at the necklace in his palm. I should have listened to her better. Maeve looked at the pearls. I've been holding on to this for 2 years, he said, telling myself it was Evelyn's, and it should stay Evelyn's. And that was the right thing. He stopped. Started again more carefully. I think I was holding on to it because it was easier than deciding what came next. And I've been doing that with a lot of things. He looked at her. I'm not asking you to replace her, he said. I think you know that. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you already are, which is considerable. He said the last word like he'd found it after looking for a while, like it was the truest one available. I'm asking if you'd be willing to take this, not as a transaction, not as a symbol of something owed, just as mine given to you, because I want you to have it. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about October and the wagon and the $50 in the small room off the kitchen. She thought about June's fever and Caleb crying in the hallway and the Platt map spread across the kitchen table and the creek bank in the dark, and I decided, I'm glad said to a man's back at a kitchen stove. She thought about how many times in the last 5 months she had told herself to want less. Keep wanting less until the wanting matched the situation, and the situation was something she could survive. She thought about how exhausting it was to keep doing that, how much of herself it cost. She reached out and took the necklace from his hand. She didn't put it on immediately. She just held it, the pearls cool and small in her palm, and looked at the meadow and the wildflowers and the improbable blue sky of a late March morning in Wyoming. You said she believed things you were afraid of losing shouldn't be locked up, Maeve said. Yes, she was right. He looked at her sidelong. The expression on his face was not something she had a word for, yet. She thought she might need to learn a new word for it. I know, he said. I'm trying. She put the necklace in her coat pocket for safekeeping. They walked the meadow for an hour in the thin spring sun, not talking much, just walking. She looked at the wildflowers, and he looked at the fence line on the east ridge that needed work, and they were both comfortable doing this, existing alongside each other, without the constant negotiation of words, and that in itself was something she valued more than she could easily say. On the walk back, he told her about Evelyn. He did it carefully, incrementally, the way he did everything, not a flood, but a measured release, one thing at a time. He told her that Evelyn had been patient with him to a fault and had occasionally told him so directly, which he deserved. He told her that she had kept a journal for 15 years and he had never read it because it felt like an intrusion. And he had hidden it at the back of a shelf in his office because he couldn't throw it away, couldn't look at it either. He told her that June had Evelyn's laugh, which was the thing he found hardest and also the thing he was most grateful for. He told her that Evelyn had said once, in the last months of her illness, that his problem was not that he didn't love people enough, but that he loved them so much that he couldn't stand to be seen doing it, and that hiding it was not the same as not feeling it, but it amounted to the same thing for the people on the other side of it. He stopped walking when he said that last part. They were at the edge of the cottonwoods, just where the meadow ended and the trail began. She was right about that too, he said. Silas, I'm not going to make this into a speech. I'm bad at speeches, but I want you to know that I see you, not as the woman who keeps the house and saves the water, writes and nurses the sick children. He met her eyes. I see you, the whole thing. She pressed her lips together. She had been told, over the course of her 18 years, a number of things that were meant to describe her. She had been told she was a burden, had been told she was convenient. She had been told, in the language of the transaction that had brought her here, that she was worth $50. Nobody had ever told her that they saw her, the whole thing. I don't quite know what to do with that, she said honestly. Neither do I, he said, but I thought you should have it regardless. She looked at the trail through the cottonwoods. She thought about the pearl necklace in her pocket. She thought about a woman she'd never met who had scattered her ashes in a meadow where things bloomed early and had believed that what you loved should not be locked away. Then we'll figure out what to do with it, she said, together. Badly, probably, and slowly. Probably, he agreed. They walked back through the cottonwoods. The figuring out was, in fact, slow and imperfect and occasionally bad in the specific ways that two people who have both spent considerable time closed up will be bad at opening. There were evenings in April where he retreated into silence, so complete she couldn't find a way into it, and had to remind herself that this was the shape of him, not rejection. There were moments where she pulled back from things she felt, because pulling back was her oldest habit and the hardest one to break. There were misunderstandings, small ones mostly, but real, that required the kind of conversation neither of them was naturally built for, and that they had to work at, separately and together, with varying levels of success. Caleb watched all of this with the attention of a born observer and said nothing. Owen narrated it constantly without realizing he was doing so, providing a running commentary on the state of affairs that was simultaneously unhelpful and entirely accurate. June was oblivious to everything except the increasing warmth and the fact that the barn cat had kittens. The morning the horse threw Caleb was a Saturday in early May. It was not the most violent accident she had ever seen. The horse was frightened by something, a sound from the west pasture, and shied sideways hard. And Caleb was reaching for the gate latch at that exact moment and was not holding the reins properly because he was 8 and overconfident in the way that 8-year-old horses their whole lives become overconfident. And the horse's shoulder caught him full and sent him into the fence post and then down into the mud. Owen saw it happen from the yard and screamed once, a single sharp sound, and Maeve was out the back door before she had fully processed what she'd heard. Caleb was on his back in the mud when she reached him. His eyes were open, and she felt her heart seize and then release when she saw them open, but they were not right. He was looking at the sky with a blankness that was not Caleb's blankness, not his careful managed expression, but something absent, somewhere else. Caleb, she knelt beside him. Caleb, look at me. He looked at her, or he looked toward her. She couldn't tell, and not being able to tell was the most frightening thing she had experienced since June's fever. Silas, she called. He was there in 20 seconds. He took one look at Caleb and the expression that crossed his face there and gone, before it could be witnessed, fully was the expression of a man looking directly at his deepest fear. Don't move him, Maeve said. Not yet. He needs to. She put 2 fingers gently against Caleb's jaw and turned his face toward her, slowly, watching his eyes. Caleb, tell me your name. A pause. A long one that felt like falling. Caleb, he said. His voice was different, slow, like it had to travel from somewhere far away to get to his mouth. Good. What's my name? Longer pause. May. Does anything hurt? My head, he said. My head hurts a lot. Silas made a sound she had not heard from him before, involuntary, barely audible, the kind of sound a person makes when they are holding something enormous very tightly to prevent it from breaking loose. He glanced at him once. His jaw was rigid. His hands were flat on his knees, and she could see that he was pressing them down. Okay, she said to Caleb steadily. You're going to stay still for a few minutes. You're going to keep your head flat. Don't try to get up. She looked at Owen, who was standing 3 feet away, with both hands pressed over his mouth, his eyes enormous. Owen, go inside and get the blanket off the settee. Bring it out here. He went. He needed to go, needed the task, needed to be moving. Turned to Silas. She kept her voice low. He took a blow to the right side of his head. I don't know how bad it is. We need to keep him warm, and we need to get him inside without jolting him, and we need the doctor from Millhaven. 4 hours, Silas said. I know. Can you ride that in 2? He looked at her. Yes, then go. I'll stay with him. Silas's hand moved. She saw it. The instinct to touch his son, to put his hand on Caleb the way a person reaches for something they're afraid of losing. He stopped himself. Because Caleb needed not to be moved, and Silas understood this, and the understanding of it cost him visibly. Go, she said again, gently. He went. She stayed on her knees in the mud beside Caleb for the 4 hours that followed, and they were among the longest hours of her life. Kept him talking when he was awake, asking him things. The names of the horses, the rules of checkers, everything he remembered about his mother's potato soup, and when he slept, which he did twice in the first 2 hours. She woke him at careful intervals and asked him his name and her name and what day it was. Owen sat against the fence post, wrapped in his own coat, and refused to go inside regardless of what she said about it, which she eventually stopped fighting because she understood it, and because Owen's presence, quiet, watchful, scared but steady, was its own form of company. June had been kept inside by the simple luck of having been napping when it happened. Caleb didn't know this, and kept asking for her with a regularity that told Maeve he was more frightened than he was showing. Which was a very Caleb thing to do. "She's inside," Maeve said each time. "She's fine. You can see her when you're better. Promise?" "Yes." Around the 3rd hour, when the light was going golden and long across the pasture, and Caleb was awake and holding steady, he looked up at her from the mud with his father's dark eyes and said, in a voice that was more like itself than it had been earlier, "I thought you left." She looked at him. "When you went," he said, "that night in February, I thought you weren't coming back." "I came back, I know, but I thought—" He stopped. He was 8 years old, and he had lost one person already, and he was lying in the mud with a head injury. And his father was gone, and he was, under all the careful composure, simply a child who was scared. "I thought if you left it was because we weren't worth staying for. Me and Owen and June." She put her hand on his arm. "Careful. Just present. Listen to me," she said. "I need you to hear this and hold on to it. Are you listening?" "Yes. I left because I got hurt, and I was angry, and I made a choice before I'd finished thinking it through. That is my fault. That is not something that had anything to do with you, or your brother, or your sister. Do you understand?" He was quiet. "Caleb." "I understand," he said. "But you still almost left." "I did," she said. "And I came back. Because this is where I belong." He looked at the sky. He thought about this in the slow, careful way he thought about everything. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay? Okay," he said again, as if it were settled. As if he had decided to let it be settled, and that was the end of it, which for Caleb it probably was. She kept her hand on his arm. The doctor arrived with Silas as the last light was leaving the sky. Silas had made the 4-hour ride in 2.5, which was not 2, but was close enough. The doctor was a small man named Hartley, with a methodical manner and no wasted movements, and he examined Caleb on the settee to which they'd carefully moved him an hour before, and he asked questions, and he pressed his fingers along the sides of Caleb's head, and he held up a lamp and looked at his eyes, and he said, eventually, that the boy had a significant concussion and would need rest and watching for the next several days, but that his responsiveness was good and his pupils even, and he did not believe there was deeper damage. Silas received this information standing very still in the middle of the front room, with his hat in his hands and his coat still on. He said, "He'll be all right," the doctor said. "With proper rest and someone watching him closely. Yes, he'll be all right." Silas sat down in the nearest chair. He sat there for a long moment. He still had his coat on. His hat was in his hands, and he was looking at it like he wasn't entirely sure where he was, like some part of him was still on the road between here and Millhaven, riding hard against the clock. Maeve sat down beside him. She didn't touch him. She just sat beside him in the chair nearest his, close enough that he could feel she was there, and she waited. The doctor was talking to Owen in the doorway. June had come downstairs when she heard the commotion and was sitting on the bottom step, watching everything with enormous 3-year-old eyes, her cloth rabbit in her arms. Silas exhaled. It came out like something he'd been holding since he saw Caleb in the mud, long and ragged and entirely private, and she was the only one close enough to hear it. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that while the doctor finished and packed his bag and told them what to watch for in the night ahead. They sat like that while Owen herded June back upstairs with the gravity of someone who has been given an important task. They sat like that until the house had quieted to the specific sound of a night that was still difficult but no longer in crisis. He didn't let go of her hand. She didn't take it back. Caleb's recovery was slow and followed the pattern that she supposed. All recoveries followed better, then worse for a day, then better again in increments. He slept a great deal the first 3 days, and she checked on him at intervals through the night, logging his breathing, waking him when she needed to, sitting in the chair by his bed in the dark, with her hands in her lap. On the 4th day, he was sitting up and eating soup. On the 5th day, he asked for his book. On the 6th day, he appeared at the kitchen table for breakfast and sat down and said, "To no one in particular, my head still hurts, but it's a different kind of hurting." "A better kind?" Owen asked. "A getting better kind," Caleb said. "There's a difference." He looked at Maeve when he said it. She put oatmeal in front of him. He picked up the spoon and said, without looking up, "Thank you." Saying, "You already thanked me," she said. "I know. I'm thanking you again." She sat down across from him. "You're welcome." Again. He ate his oatmeal. The morning light came through the kitchen window and moved across the table, and the house was warm, and outside the Wyoming spring was finally, decisively winning its argument with winter, the green coming in everywhere now. The cottonwoods leafed out, the meadow she had walked with Silas, full and blooming. It was a Wednesday in late May when Silas asked her properly. She was in the garden she'd been putting in along the south wall, a practical garden, herbs and vegetables, the kind that justified itself by being useful, though she had also put in a row of zinnias that served no purpose whatsoever, except that she liked them. And she had decided at some point in the last 7 months that liking a thing was sufficient reason to make room for it. He came out from the barn and stood at the garden and fence and watched her for a moment. "I need to ask you something," he said. She sat back on her heels. She had mud on her hands, and her hat was crooked, and she looked. She knew nothing like the woman anyone would write a story about, just a person in a garden on a Wednesday. "All right. I need to ask you formally," he said, "because everything else between us has been informal, circumstantial, and you deserve the formal version." She looked at him. He was not comfortable with this. She could see that, and she was glad she could see it because his discomfort was honest, and honesty was the thing she valued most from him. He had cleaned up. He was wearing a cleaner shirt than a Wednesday afternoon usually called for, which she noticed, and he was holding his hat in front of him with both hands, which he did when he was working out how to say something. "I'm asking if you'll marry me," he said. "Not because it makes things simpler, or because it's practical, or because it settles any question people in town might be asking. Because I want you to be my wife. Because you are the best person I know, and I have done a poor job of making sure you knew that, and I'm trying to do better." He stopped, looked at his hat. "That's most of it." "Most of it," she said. "The rest is harder to say." "Say it anyway." He looked up. "Love you. I have been afraid to love you because I have already learned what it costs to love someone and lose them, and I am not." He stopped. "I am not a brave man in that particular way, but I am trying to be." She looked at him across the garden fence in the late May afternoon, this difficult and private and slowly opening man who had driven 4 hours in the cold to kneel in the snow, and then ridden 2.5 hours in 2 to bring a doctor to his son, who repaired things silently because he didn't have words for caring, who had sat in a chair with his coat on and let her take his hand and not let go. Speents. She thought about what she had told him on the creek bank. "I never needed you to love me. I just needed to matter." She had meant it when she said it. She meant it differently now, not because the needing had changed, but because she understood more fully what she'd been asking for, which was not a small thing. It had never been a small thing. She had been asking, in the only language available to her at the time, for the right to be a person in a place that had bought her as a function, for the acknowledgement that she existed beyond her usefulness. He had given her that, slowly, imperfectly, in the ways that were available to him. And in giving it, he had given her something she hadn't known to ask for the room to feel what she felt, without fearing it would cost her the ground under her feet. Pulled off her garden gloves. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of a man who had expected to have to fight for this, just a settling, a landing. Relief that had been compressed into a small space being allowed to take up its proper room. Yes, she said again, because she wanted to say it twice. And for what it's worth, I know what it costs to love someone. I know exactly. And I'm choosing it anyway. He came around the gate. He was still not a man who moved easily in affectionate territory, who knew what to do with his body when words had been said that changed the composition of a room. He stood in front of her, with his hat in his hand and his cleaner shirt and the afternoon light behind him, and he looked at her the way she had caught him looking, when he thought she wasn't paying attention, like something he was afraid to count on. Counted on it. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and then he covered her hand with his. They were standing like that when Owen appeared at the garden gate. He looked at them. He looked at their hands. He looked at the general situation with the comprehensive attention of a 6-year-old processing information. "Are you getting married?" he said. "Yes," Maeve said. Owen turned and ran back toward the house, screaming for Caleb with a volume that was probably audible in the next valley. She laughed. She had not laughed like that, and she couldn't remember. It came up from somewhere below her ribs, and she couldn't stop it, and she didn't try. Silas watched her laugh. His expression was the one she still didn't have a word for. She was going to need a long time with this man to find all the words. She was looking forward to the time. Gideon Pike arrived on a Tuesday in June. She saw him coming from the kitchen window, recognized the slope of his shoulders before she could see his face, that particular defeated curve that she associated with a man who had been losing arguments with himself for years. He was older. He looked diminished. His horse was tired, and he was riding it poorly, which told her he'd come a distance. She dried her hands. She went to the front door and opened it before he reached the porch. Stopped when he saw her. He took off his hat. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. 18 years of her life had been shaped in some part by this man's decisions, by his resentment and his carelessness, and the particular cruelty of being related to someone who treated you as an inconvenience. He was the person who had counted $50 onto a table without looking at her face. He was the person who had sent her into the cold with a stranger. He was also old and tired and had ridden a long way to be here, and she was not going to pretend she didn't know what that cost a man like him. "Maeve," he said. His voice was different. The edge was gone from it, and without the edge it was just the voice of an old man, ordinary and a little uncertain. "Gideon," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I heard you were, that you'd—" He stopped, looked at the house behind her, the garden along the south wall, the barn where Silas was working. "I heard things were well. Things are well." He nodded. He looked at the ground. "I came because I—" Stop. He was working for it. She could see the effort. "I came because I did something that I've known was wrong since the day I did it. Maybe before, and I am old enough now to—" He pressed his lips together. "I sold you," he said. "I sold you like you were mine to sell. And you were a child, and you were my brother's daughter, and I had no right. I have never had any right." She leaned against the doorframe. She had imagined this conversation before. In the wagon, on the creek bank, in the small room off the kitchen. She had imagined it with anger, with the specific cold clarity of telling someone exactly what they had done and watching it land. She had planned, in those imagined versions, to be very precise about the damage. Looking at him now, she felt nothing, not forgiveness that wiped the ledger clean. Something more complicated than either of those, something she didn't think had a single name. "I know you had no right," she said. "I've always known that." "Sorry, I know. I don't expect—" He stopped. "I don't expect anything. I came because I owed you the words. Whatever you do with them is yours." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it would do to her to hold on to this particular weight for the rest of her life. She thought about the energy it took to carry a grievance, not whether it was deserved, because it was completely, but what carrying it cost the person doing the carrying. She thought about Caleb crying in the hallway, on the night June's fever broke. All that compressed weight releasing at once, because he'd finally been allowed to put it down. She had been carrying Gideon Pike for a long time. She was tired of it. I forgive you, she said. I want to be clear that forgiving you doesn't mean what you did was acceptable. It wasn't. It was a harm, and it shaped my life in ways I'm still working out, and it will always have happened. She held his gaze. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life angry at you for it. It's not for your benefit. That's for mine. He looked like a man who had expected to be hit and hadn't been, and wasn't sure what to do with the lack of impact. Will you come in? She said. I'll make coffee. He came in. She made coffee. Silas came in from the barn she had sent Owen to get him with a message that simply, Gideon Pike is here, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and took the measure of the situation in the way. He took the measure of most situations, quietly and completely, and he sat down and poured himself coffee and was civil in the specific way of a man who is civil, because his wife has decided to be, and he is backing her play. She noticed he said wife. In his head, she was already his wife. She noticed she didn't correct it. Gideon left an hour later. He didn't ask to come back. She didn't invite him to. What had been said was what needed to be said, and the rest was up to time. And time was not something she was willing to predict. She stood on the porch and watched him ride out, and she felt lighter was the wrong word. More accurate was something like more fully herself. Like a thing she'd been braced against, had resolved into something she could simply live alongside without having to brace. Silas came to stand beside her. You all right? He asked. Yes, she said. I think I actually am. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She leaned into it for a moment before she straightened. The zinnias are coming in, she said. He looked at the garden. They serve no purpose, I know. You put them in anyway. Yes, she said. I did. The wedding was on a Saturday in the third week of June in the wildflower meadow below the East Ridge, in the place where things bloomed earliest and where Evelyn's ashes had returned to the ground she'd loved. It was not a large or elaborate occasion. The circuit minister came through and performed the ceremony in 20 minutes. The children were there. Owen had made himself a paper flower for his buttonhole, which had been crushed in his pocket and was beyond reconstruction. Caleb had combed his hair and lost the comb. June wore a crown of real flowers that she had allowed Maeve to place on her head very seriously and then attempted to eat one of. 3 neighboring families came, including a woman named Ruth Hatcher, who had apparently decided to withhold judgment until she could assess the situation directly, and who shook Maeve's hand after the ceremony with the grip of someone who had worked every day of their adult life, and said, You did right by those children, which was the most complete compliment Maeve received that day. Maeve wore the pearl necklace. It lay against her collarbone and caught the afternoon light, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of something that belongs to you, that has become yours through a process that cannot quite be explained. Silas said his vows in the flat, deliberate way. He said everything important, like each word had been considered before being committed to. He did not perform them. He just meant them. She said hers looking directly at him. Caleb walked beside his father when it was done. Owen walked beside Maeve, holding her hand with the air of someone performing an official function. June was already running toward the wildflowers. A month after the wedding, she found out she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for a few days. Before she told him not out of fear, but because she needed to know it fully herself first, to turn it over and examine it from all sides, to let it be real before she let it be something they navigated together. She was not someone who processed things quickly, and she was learning to stop apologizing for that. She told him in the kitchen, after supper, after the children were in bed, in the ordinary, unremarkable setting of 2 people sitting across a table at the end of a day. She said, I'm going to have a baby. He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment, the full look, the one that saw everything. And his face did something complicated and unguarded that he didn't try to manage, which she took as the best possible signs. When, he said. Winter, I think, January. He nodded slowly. She could see him thinking through what this meant, the practical things first, because that was how he was built, working from the knowable outward, and then watching him arrive at something beyond the practical, something she could see moving through his face like weather. Are you well? He said. Are you all right? I'm well, she said. A little tired in the mornings. Otherwise the same. We'll get Hartley out to check. Yes. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, the same gesture she had made the night of Caleb's accident. Presence without pressure. Being there without demanding anything from the being there. She turned her hand over and held his. Silas, she said. Yes. I want you to know that this. She paused. Found it. This is not where I expected to be. None of it. Not the ranch. Not the children. Not you. Not any of it. I didn't have any of this as a possibility when I was standing in Gideon's kitchen, watching you put money on his table. I know, he said. But I want it, she said. All of it. Exactly as it is. Broken pieces and difficult parts and everything. She looked at him. I want this life. He squeezed her hand. It wants you too, he said. It was not a poetic thing to say. He was not a poetic man, and she had stopped wanting him to be one. It was simply true, stated plainly, which was better than poetry. There is a particular thing that happens sometimes to people who have been sold short by the world, by circumstances, by other people's choices, by systems that never asked for their input. They begin to believe the valuation. They organize themselves around it, protect themselves with it, use it to manage expectations so that disappointment is a smaller target. And they are very careful for a very long time about wanting anything too much. Maeve Holloway had done this. She had done it expertly. She had survived on it. What she had learned in the last 8 months, in this cold ranch, and this difficult family, and this slow, imperfect, genuine life, was that surviving on reduced expectations was still surviving. It kept you safe. It kept you intact. But it was not the same as living. Living required wanting. Living required the willingness to risk the specific pain of caring about something enough that losing it would cost you. She had been afraid of that cost her whole life. She was not afraid of it anymore. Or she was afraid of it and she was choosing it anyway, which was not the same as not being afraid, but was possibly the more honest version of courage. She planted a young apple tree along the east wall of the garden that October, before the ground froze. Owen helped her dig the hole. Caleb observed and offered structural opinions. June contributed by moving the dirt from one place to another without being asked. It would not bear fruit for years. She knew that. She planted it anyway. Silas watched from the porch with his coffee and said nothing. But he was watching. That winter, the ranch that had stood cold and silent and half-dead the October that Maeve arrived was a different place. Not perfect. She would never use that word about anything she valued, because perfect was a way of not looking closely enough, but real. Alive in the way that things are alive when they are being genuinely used, genuinely inhabited, genuinely loved. June laughed the way Evelyn had laughed, and the sound of it filled rooms. Owen learned to make corn pudding with 2 turns of the pepper grinder and the appropriate amount of nutmeg, and he did it with the seriousness of someone preserving something important, which he was. Caleb, at 9 years old, began to uncross his arms, and Maeve, who had been sold for $50 in a kitchen in October and had arrived at this life without choosing it, sat at the table on a January morning with snow falling past the window and her hands around her coffee cup and her child beginning to make itself known inside her. And she looked at the room around her, worn and practical and full of the evidence of people living hard and close, and she thought, this is mine. Not because she had been given it, not because she had been purchased into it or assigned to it or told it was hers by someone with the authority to say so, because she had built it. One day at a time, one small act at a time, with her hands and her will and her stubborn, unglamorous refusal to be only what other people decided she was worth. Nobody gives you a life. You make it, from whatever they leave you with. She had been left very little. Look what she had made.